Hello and thanks for joining me. Today we're just going to talk a little bit about the very basics for beginners in watercolour who just fancy having a go with watercolours. So just the basic materials, basic starting point really for the properties of watercolour and what you need to be looking for. So these are my watercolours. These are Winsor and Newton. I bought this as a set quite a lot of years ago. When it originally came, it just had the two rows down either side of these are what we call half pan, this size, and then these ones in the middle I added at a later date, and these larger ones here are what we call a full pan. Now what I actually do now is I no longer buy the watercolours in pans. I buy the tubes and then I squirt them to refill them. So that's just what works well for me, but of course it's up to you which you prefer. So it's just a case of perhaps giving them both a go, but you can either get the watercolour in tubes like this or in the pans, and this one I use is Winsor & Newton, and I use the artist quality, but the student quality is fine, and those are called Cotman, so if you look out for the Cotman ones, those are the student quality ones. So I was going to say something about the pans. Oh yeah, if you buy a full pan, it's cheaper than buying two half pans. So what I've done in the past, buy a full pan and get a very sharp knife and just chop the paint in half when it comes, and take that half out and pop it into your small pan. So that's another way of doing it. Okay, so the clue is in the name with watercolour really. The most important thing about your watercolours is the volume of water that you use, and there are a few different things that affect that. So to begin with, the first thing is the paper. I've made a mess of that one already, but the paper. So there are three types of paper with watercolour. We have a smooth watercolour paper, which is called hot pressed, which is down to how it's made. The medium one is not, which means it's cold pressed basically, or not hot pressed, but we refer to that as not. And then the last one is rough, which, as it sounds, has got a much rougher surface with where the paint can soak into the paper more and sort of settle into the sort of dents in the paper, for want of a better word. So this paper is a practice paper by SAA, and it's a not one. So that's a good one to start with for beginners because it's halfway between. Smooth hot press paper is very good if you want a lot of detail, if you want to work very finely. The rougher papers are better if you want to work using an awful lot of water, so that it can absorb that water and it's not going to move around too much, and it's a bit more expressive with the rough surface and everything. So the smooth one is great for detailed work. I use it a lot with drawing when I want to do a fine drawing or something like that. But for general purposes, not is a good place for a beginner to start. Okay, and so each make of paper also behaves slightly differently. The quality, how heavy the paper is, so it's really up to you to play around and have a go with the papers that you've got. The only way with watercolours to actually learn and improve is to keep having a go. It's a tricky medium to work with. Lots of people tend to give up because they perhaps start with this idea of making a full painting, something going wrong and feeling a bit despondent with it and leaving it. The idea with watercolours and the way to improve with watercolours is to do a little bit every day, just some practice sessions, and trying out your materials and getting to know your materials, because everybody's materials are different. So it's something I can't really teach you. It's something you've got to get in and have a go at. And it's a bit like when we say about learning to draw, sketching every day in your sketchbook is the only way to progress. With watercolours, it doesn't matter if you have mistakes. Learn from those mistakes and plod on, and you'll eventually get a feel for it. So the paper's the first thing. The second thing, of course, is the amount of water that you add to your paint. So here I've made two mixes of the same colour. I'm not sure if you can quite see them. And if you can see, this one has got a lot more water in it. And this one has got less water in it. So that's just down to the ratio, the same paint, the ratio of paint pigment to water. Now if I pick that same colour up from the pan with just a tiny bit of water on my brush, that's going to be much darker again. Now the thing with watercolours is they're transparent, so we actually don't use white as such, we use the white of the paper, and in this case, because we've used a red paint, when you add a lot more water, the white of the paper shows through, and the white and the red combined give us a pinky colour. Slightly less pink, more red with less water. But the paper, you can see the white of the paper is still showing through. So it's a transparent colour. And don't forget that these will dry a lot lighter than they go on. So you've always got to be perhaps thinking a little bit on the brighter side when you're putting them on, because they will fade as they dry. And you'll see that as this video goes on, that those will fade the colours a little as they're drying. Now, as far as adding to them, so what we've done here is called painting wet onto dry. We had a completely dry surface that we put wet paint onto. Another technique is called painting wet into wet. As it sounds, that's putting wet paint onto wet paper or onto wet paint onto wet paint. So onto the wet paper you can see it flows a little more than the first one did and moves around more. Now if you put it onto the paint, this is where the fun really begins, because you can get this really wrong. If you put into the high concentration of water, sorry, the low concentration of water, if you put an even higher amount of water in, it's going to cause a mess. So putting that one into that one, if you see on the top, you're adding an awful lot more water than was already there, and as that moves, it's making a mess. It's making what we call a cauliflower. The water's moving out into that pigment. So what we always do is add a higher concentration of paint into a lower concentration, and that way they blend in quite nicely with none of this cauliflower business that's going on here. And then again, if we take the one that was like this straight from the pan and add that, again it's not making a mess, it's going to blend in. So the thing is to add more paint, less water each time. So we're going from a high concentration of water to a much lower concentration of water. And can you see how this is making a mess? Now sometimes you might actually like that, and it might not matter if you do that, because you might do it and think, oh heck, what a mess I've made, but then you could turn it into a shape, a tree, whatever. So it's not always the massive problem that it appears, but in general, if you think, right, a higher concentration of paint pigment each time, you're going to have less of these accidents and problems that we find with watercolour. Okay, so we talked about the actual volume of, so you've got so far two things that affect the amount of water that you're adding. One's the paper, how quickly it moves on the paper, how much it sinks in. The second was how much actual water we put in. The third thing to really think about is your brush, because these brushes, if you want to think of them as a sponge, you pop the sponge in completely dry into your pot of water, and it soaks up that water, and it's full of water now. You can see I squashed it out how much water's in there. Just fill it up again. So you've got your full sponge brush. When you put it on the paper and you add pressure with your hand, that sponge, it's like squeezing that sponge out and it's coming out onto your paper. So that could cause things like this to happen. If you've got a full brush of water and you pop that into, or you touch even the side, that's dry already, so it's actually not causing too much problem. That will suck up that water. Okay, so the drier pigment on the paper is picking up the water, bringing out the water from the brush. So each brush, depending on what it's made of, holds a different amount of water. So it's up to you to get to know your own brushes and prevent things like this happening. I sometimes give mine a quick flick like that behind me, so I've got mess all over the floor, just to dry them out. Another way to dry them out is like I did before, and just give it a squeeze or with a tissue. But you know, if you want to work on this perhaps by moving it around, painting actually with it, moving these colours around, and you don't want to introduce more water, give it a quick squeeze first, or rub it on the side of your pot. So this brush is a Cotman one, again Winsor & Newton, and that's a size 12. Now, so this is completely synthetic. And I have a few of these synthetic brushes and they're pretty handy. You can see this one I've had for years, all the colour's gone off the stick there, but there's nothing wrong with the bristles whatsoever. It's still one I use quite a lot. So they last. The synthetic ones are sturdy, they last. A flat one's another good shape to have. You know, you can make all sorts of techniques with that. So a flat one's a good one to have. But these ones here are what we call a round shape, and it's nice to have a good point. So when it goes back together, it should all come into a nice point like that, and you can see a nice point on that one. So if I was for beginners, I would suggest this one here is a number 4. So a number 4 or a number 6, something like that, round. So if you go into the shop to buy your brush and you're not sure, you see a vast array of all different shapes and sizes, and you panic a little, think, oh, I don't know what to buy, go for a number 4 or a number 6 round. Just ask for a synthetic round, and that was probably a good one to get going with. So as well as the synthetic ones, I use also all sorts of things. This one's a squirrel, that's what's nice for doing flower petals and things like that, because the shape that it sort of comes into at the end there. That one's badger, you can see it's badger by the colours there, and that's what we call a fan brush, and it's good for making little shapes and things. But I wouldn't recommend, if you're just starting out and you want the basics, just go for a round to begin with. I don't have too many very small brushes because I don't tend to do masses of detail. I have a couple of little brushes that I use for things like eyes as I get to the end of the painting, to put that extra detail in the eyes and things like that, but most of them are quite large, my brushes. I'll start with something as big as that, which is a mop brush to get the paper nice and wet before I begin. Okay, and so these are some of the sable brushes, which I'm sure you realise are much more expensive. So I use them as well. Okay, but like I say, there's absolutely nothing wrong with starting off with the synthetic ones. They're very, very sturdy and very handy. The other thing you're going to need with watercolours, which I use an awful lot of, is a little spray bottle. You don't have to buy a special one. You could use one that you've perhaps had something in, a cosmetic or cleaning product that you clean out, and then use it for spraying your water. As it's drying out, you might want things to move a bit more. So yeah, that's really handy, is your water bottle. And as far as your colours are concerned, when you want to go and buy your first set of watercolours, go for your 3 primary colours. So perhaps a cobalt blue, a yellow, either a sienna, raw sienna, or perhaps a cadmium yellow, and then a red, so perhaps a cadmium red or a bright red. Just you know, if you just have a play around with your 3 primaries, there's an awful lot you can learn from that without going out and buying a full set. But always buy the best you can afford. Students' quality in a good make, such as Winsor & Newton for an example. Trying to think of another one, Reeves. And you know, if it's a good make, there's nothing wrong with buying student quality ones rather than the artist quality ones to begin with. But don't go and buy very cheap paints, unknown brands, because you'll get very disappointed with yourself with the results that you get from them. And the other thing that of course we need quite handy is tissue. So I've always got that to the side. I've always got bits of tissue that you can lift out. Now this lifting out process, you know, perhaps you think, oh, I want to get the paper back to white there, and you lift it out. Again, that very much depends on the paper, the quality of the paper. You'll find a cheap paper, you won't be able to do that. So again, it's worth paying that little bit extra to get a good paper, so you can do all the techniques that watercolours are capable of. When you're beginning, it's nice to buy your paper in a pad, so you can keep all your work together and see how you're progressing. And don't throw anything away, and if you have mistakes, learn from them, write little notes on them. Yeah, and different colours as well. With this lifting out, different colours will lift out easier than others. Blues lift out a lot more easy than red will lift out. Red's a dye, it sinks into the paper and it dyes your paper quite quickly. Very difficult to get red back off the paper, but blue is very easy. I'll just perhaps show you a little bit of cobalt here. Don't know if I'm still in shot, but I'm thinking I probably am. So you could use your blue for your sky, and then with a dry brush lift out to make some clouds. So it does lift out quite easily with the blue back to the, and you can give it, you know, and if it's a good paper you can give it quite a good scrubbing with your brush and lift it out there. So you can see how you could make clouds quite easily on the blue there, whereas with the red it does actually stain the paper quite a lot. Okay, so I'm hoping that's enough just to get you going. Like I say, it was just to tell you about the basics that you need, and the basic properties of watercolour. The most important thing is think about the volume of water and to have a play. Keep having a go with it. Don't get despondent when accidents happen. Just keep trying, because you need to get to know your own materials, how your brush works with your paper and your paint, those three things together, and the volume of water that you use. I work very much wet in wet. I use an awful lot of water, but you might like to work more precisely than I do. Okay, so if I was recommend the three things perhaps to buy would be your 3 primary colours in a good quality watercolour paint, a number 6 round brush, synthetic, and a pad of not watercolour paper. Okay, so I hope that's a help to you. If you've any questions at all, just pop them in the comment section or message me. You can email me if you follow the link from my website, my email's there. But just, you know, always don't be afraid to ask. I'm quite happy to answer any questions because I do appreciate it's a tricky medium for beginners. So anything you want to ask at all, just give me a shout and let me know what you think of the video as well, and if there is there anything else that you would like me to do in another video another time. I will come back and do a video completely on colour, just talking about complementary colours and tones and everything involving colour really, and we'll talk about that in another video. But for today that's all on this little beginner's tutorial. I hope it's been a help for you, and thanks again for watching. Bye bye.